The distress beacon had been crying out into the void for 16 standard cycles. It was a simple signal, repeating the same message over and over again in every known language of the galaxy. Help us. We are dying. Please, someone help us. The signal came from Seven, a small mining colony in the outer rim of the galaxy. It was home to 3 million beings from a dozen different species. They were miners, traders, families, and children. They had built their lives on that distant rock, far from the politics of the Galactic Council, far from the wars that sometimes swept through the stars. They had believed they were safe. They were wrong. The swarm had found them. In the Great Hall of the Galactic Council, Ambassador stood before the emergency assembly and delivered the news that everyone had feared. His pale skin seemed even paler under the harsh lights, and his long antennae trembled as he spoke. The had arrived at 7 3 days ago. The colony's defenses had fallen within hours. Now the swarm's ships surrounded the planet like a dark cloud, and they were feeding. The council members listened in silence. They all knew what they were. Every species in the galaxy had heard the stories. The swarm did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They did not stop. They moved from world to world, consuming everything in their path. Entire civilizations had been erased by them. Planets that once held billions of souls now floated empty and dead in the cold darkness of space. Ambassador finished his report and waited for the council to respond. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the questions began. How many ships did they have? Hundreds, perhaps thousands. How long could Seven hold out? Days at most, maybe less. Where was the nearest council fleet? Too far. It would take weeks to gather enough ships to mount a rescue. The math was simple and cruel. By the time help could arrive, everyone on Seven would be dead. The council members began to argue among themselves. Some called for immediate action, even if it meant sending ships to their destruction. Others argued that it was foolish to waste resources on a battle that could not be won. Better to let Seven fall and focus on defending worlds that could actually be saved. The debate grew heated, voices rising and falling, but beneath all the words was a simple truth that no one wanted to say out loud. They were afraid. They had never been stopped. No fleet, no matter how large, had ever driven them back. To fight them was to die. It was then that the human delegation asked to speak. The council fell silent. Humans were new to the galactic community. They had only been part of it for 12 years, ever since their first faster-than-light ship had stumbled into space and nearly caused an interstellar incident. In those 12 years, humans had earned a reputation. They were primitive, their technology decades behind the other species. They were aggressive, prone to violence, and dangerously unpredictable. Most of the older species viewed them as little more than clever animals who had somehow learned to build starships. Commander Jack Harrison stepped forward. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His uniform was simple compared to the elaborate robes of the council members, but he wore it with a quiet pride that made the finery around him seem foolish. He looked at the holographic display that showed Seven and the fleet surrounding it. He studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to face the council. "We will answer the call," he said. The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one seemed to understand what he meant. Then Ambassador stepped forward, his antennae twitching with confusion. "Commander Harrison," he said carefully, "perhaps you do not understand the situation. The number in the hundreds of thousands. Their ships are organic war machines that heal themselves in battle. They have destroyed entire fleets. What forces do you have in this sector?" Jack did not hesitate. "One carrier group," he said, 6 vessels, 2,000 soldiers." A murmur ran through the council. Some of the members actually laughed. 6 ships against the swarm. It was absurd. It was suicide. One of the elder council members, a large creature covered in thick blue scales, leaned forward in his seat. "Human," he said, his voice deep and rumbling, "your courage is admirable, but this is not a battle you can win. The mathematics are clear. If you send your ships to 7, they will be destroyed. Your soldiers will die. You will accomplish nothing." Jack turned to face him. His expression did not change. With respect, he said, "I did not ask for your permission." The council chamber erupted in noise. Some shouted in anger, others in disbelief. But Jack Harrison did not wait to hear them. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, his boots echoing on the polished floor. Ambassador caught up with him at the door. "Commander," he said, his voice urgent, "please reconsider. I have studied your species. I know you are brave, but bravery alone will not save those people. If you go to 7, you will die with them." Jack stopped walking. He turned to look at, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across his face. "Ambassador," he said quietly, 3 million people sent a message into the darkness, hoping that someone would hear them. Someone did. We did. And where I come from, we do not ignore a cry for help just because answering it might be dangerous." He paused, and his voice grew softer. "My grandfather was a firefighter. When I was a boy, I asked him why he ran into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. He told me that some things matter more than being safe. He told me that the measure of a person is not what they do when things are easy, but what they do when things are hard." Jack placed his hand on shoulder. "Those people on 7 are calling for help. Maybe we cannot save them all. Maybe we cannot save any of them. But I would rather die trying than live knowing I did nothing." He removed his hand and walked through the door. Behind him, the council chamber had fallen silent. Ambassador stood alone, watching the human commander disappear down the corridor. Within the hour, the 6 ships of the human carrier group began their journey to 7. They flew into the darkness, toward a battle that every calculation said they could not win. And the galaxy watched, not knowing that everything was about to change. The journey to 7 took 18 hours. 18 hours of silence in the corridors of the USS Resolute. 18 hours of soldiers checking their weapons and writing letters to families they might never see again. 18 hours of officers staring at tactical displays and trying to find some strategy that might keep them alive. Lieutenant Commander Lisa had not slept. She stood on the bridge of the Resolute, her eyes fixed on the navigation screen that counted down the minutes until they arrived. She was 34 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much death for someone her age. She had joined the Navy because she wanted to protect people. Now she was flying toward a battle that would probably kill her. She did not regret it, not for a moment. Captain Cole walked onto the bridge and stood beside her. He was an older man in his 50s, with gray hair at his temples and deep lines around his eyes. He had served in the Navy for 30 years, had fought in a dozen battles, had buried more friends than he cared to remember. He looked at the navigation screen and said nothing for a long moment. "How are the crew?" he asked finally. Lisa turned to face him, scared, she said honestly, but ready. Nodded slowly. "Good. Scared is smart. Anyone who is not scared right now is not paying attention." He walked to the center of the bridge and looked around at his crew. They were young, most of them. Engineers, pilots, weapons officers, communications specialists. They had trained for years for moments like this, but training could only prepare you so much. When the shooting started, everything changed. "All hands," said, his voice calm and steady, "this is Captain Cole." The ship fell silent. Every crew member on every deck stopped what they were doing and listened. "In approximately 2 hours, we will arrive at 7. When we get there, we will face the largest enemy fleet any of us has ever seen. The swarm has never been defeated. Every tactical model we have says that we cannot win this battle." He paused and let his words sink in. "But I did not join this Navy to run from impossible odds. None of us did. Down on that planet there are 3 million souls who sent a message into the void, hoping that someone would hear them. Someone did. We did. And we did not come here to watch them die." He straightened his shoulders and spoke the ancient creed of the human fleet. the words that had been passed down from generation to generation since humanity first took to the stars. No one gets left behind. Across the ship, voices echoed back. No one gets left behind. Nodded once, then turned back to the navigation screen. Prepare for combat, he said quietly. 2 hours later, the human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. What they saw made Lisa's blood run cold. The fleet was massive beyond anything she had imagined. Hundreds of ships, maybe thousands, each one a twisted mass of organic matter and dark metal. They swarmed around 7 like insects around a corpse, their hulls pulsing with an ugly red light. The planet below was burning. Great fires spread across its surface, and clouds of black smoke rose into the atmosphere. The colony's shields were failing. Lisa could see them flickering, growing weaker with each passing moment. Escape pods drifted through space, tiny dots of light against the darkness. Some of them were heading toward safety. Others were being picked off by hunters, destroyed one by one. Lisa looked at the tactical display and felt her heart sink. 6 ships against this. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter waiting to happen. But beside her, Captain Cole did not hesitate. All ships, he said into the fleet-wide channel, form up on my position. We are going in. The 6 human ships surged forward. They noticed them immediately. A portion of the swarm broke away from the main fleet and moved to intercept. There were at least 50 of them, each one larger than any human vessel. Studied the approaching enemy and made his calculations. He knew they could not fight the entire swarm. That was impossible, but they did not need to win the battle. They just needed to buy time. All ships, he said, our primary objective is evacuation. We hold the line while the colony ships escape. Every minute we give them is another 1,000 lives saved. Focus your fire on any ship that approaches the evacuation corridor. Ignore all others. The first ships came into weapons range, and the battle began. The human ships opened fire with everything they had. Missiles streaked through space, leaving trails of white light. Energy weapons flashed and crackled. The first wave of ships took heavy damage, their organic hulls splitting and burning. But they kept coming, and as they came, they fired back. The USS Sentinel was the first human ship to take a hit. A massive bolt of energy slammed into its port side, tearing through armor and bulkheads. The ship shuddered but held together, returning fire even as smoke poured from its wounds. Lisa coordinated the defense from the bridge of the Resolute. She directed fire, called out targets, managed the chaos of battle with a calm voice that belied the terror in her heart. Around her, the bridge crew worked with desperate efficiency, every person doing their job without hesitation. The colony ships began to launch. Lisa watched them on her screen, little dots of hope rising from the burning planet below. Each one carried hundreds of refugees, families fleeing the destruction of their home. They needed time to reach safety, time that the human fleet was paying for in blood. A hunter broke through the defensive line and headed straight for one of the colony ships. Lisa saw it happening and reacted without thinking. "All batteries target that ship," she shouted. "Do not let it through." The Resolute turned and opened fire. The hunter twisted and dodged, but it could not escape the barrage. It exploded in a ball of orange flame, and the colony ship flew past its wreckage toward safety. On the bridge, someone let out a cheer, but there was no time to celebrate. More ships were coming, and the battle was only beginning. Captain Cole watched the chaos unfold around him and made a decision. He opened a channel to all ships. "This is Captain Cole," he said. "They are going to try to overwhelm us with numbers. Do not let them. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and remember why we are here. Those colony ships must escape, whatever it takes." He closed the channel and turned to Lisa. "Lieutenant Commander," he said quietly, "how many colony ships have launched?" 12, she replied. "Approximately 18,000 refugees on board." Nodded. "Good, keep them moving." Outside, the stars burned with weapons fire, and the human fleet held the line. They had consumed 1,000 worlds. They had faced 100 different species, each with their own ships, their own weapons, their own ways of war. All of them had fought with logic. All of them had made calculated retreats when the numbers turned against them. All of them had prioritized the survival of their forces over everything else. The humans fought differently. Lieutenant Marshall was 26 years old. He had grown up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, had joined the Navy to see the stars, had trained for 3 years to become a fighter pilot. Now he sat in the cockpit of his small attack craft, surrounded by enemy ships that wanted him dead. His squadron had been assigned to protect the evacuation corridor. For the past 2 hours, they had been doing exactly that, shooting down any ship that came too close to the fleeing colony vessels. They had lost half their pilots already. The remaining 6 were running low on ammunition and fuel. Checked his displays and saw a carrier moving toward the corridor. It was enormous, easily 10 times the size of the human vessels. Its hull was covered with launch bays, and from those bays poured hundreds of smaller fighters. If it reached the evacuation route, it would tear the colony ships apart. Opened a channel to his squadron. "That carrier has to go down," he said. "Anyone have any missiles left?" "Negative," came the reply from his wingman. "We are down to guns only." Looked at his own weapons display. He had 1 missile left, 1 missile against a ship that size would do nothing. The carrier's armor was too thick, its hull too strong. Even a direct hit would barely scratch it. Unless he could get inside. Studied the carrier on his screen. Its launch bays were open, fighters streaming out in endless waves. Those bays led directly to the ship's interior, to its engines and power core. If he could get a missile in there, the damage would be catastrophic. But the only way to do that was to fly into the bay itself. He made his decision in less than a second. "Squadron," he said calmly, "cover me. I am going in." His wingman said, "That is a suicide run." "I know." He pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the carrier. The fighters tried to intercept him, but his wingman and the remaining pilots drew their fire, buying him precious seconds. Weaved through the chaos, his craft spinning and rolling to avoid enemy weapons. The carrier grew larger and larger in his viewport until it filled his entire view. He saw the launch bay ahead of him, a dark opening in the ship's hull. Fighters were still pouring out of it, and he had to dodge between them, missing collisions by meters. Alarms screamed in his cockpit. Warning lights flashed. He ignored them all. At the last moment, just as he entered the bay, launched his missile and ejected. His seat rocketed away from the craft as the missile flew into the carrier's interior. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the carrier's hull began to glow from within, cracks of light spreading across its surface like a breaking egg. The explosion started deep inside and worked its way out, tearing the massive ship apart from the inside. His ejection seat carried him away from the blast, and he tumbled through space, watching the carrier die. His wingman swooped in and caught him with a tractor beam, pulling him to safety. On the bridge of the Resolute, Lisa watched the carrier explode and allowed herself a small smile. "That is how you do it," she whispered. But the battle was far from over. On the other side of the defensive line, Sergeant Amy Torres was leading a boarding party onto a ship. It sounded insane, and it probably was. But the vessel had been disabled by weapons fire, and it was drifting toward one of the colony ships. If someone did not stop it, it would crash into the refugee vessel and kill everyone on board. Amy and her team of 12 Marines had volunteered for the mission. They had attached their shuttle to the ship's hull, cut through the outer armor, and now they were fighting their way through the alien corridors. The inside of the ship was like a nightmare. The walls were made of some kind of organic material that pulsed and moved. The air was thick and hot, filled with a smell like rotting meat, and everywhere there were soldiers. They were smaller than Amy had expected, about the size of large dogs, but they were fast and vicious. They had too many legs and too many teeth, and they attacked in waves, climbing over each other to reach the humans. Amy fired her rifle until it was empty, then switched to her sidearm, then to her combat knife. Beside her, her Marines did the same. They fought for every meter, leaving a trail of dead behind them. 40 minutes after they boarded, they reached the ship's control center. Amy planted explosives on the navigation system and set the timer. Then she led her surviving team back to the shuttle, fighting their way out the same way they had come in. They made it with seconds to spare. The explosives detonated and the ship's engines shut down. It stopped drifting and hung motionless in space, no longer a threat to anyone. Amy sat in the shuttle and counted her team. She had started with 12 Marines. She was returning with 7. The human fleet had been fighting for nearly 12 hours when the USS Sentinel's reactor began to fail. Chief Engineer Ben had been working nonstop to keep the ship running, but there was only so much he could do. The damage was too severe. The reactor was going critical, and there was no way to stop it. Ben made his report to the Sentinel's captain and received his orders: evacuate the crew, abandon ship. But as Ben looked at the tactical display, he saw something that changed his mind. The command ship was nearby, the central vessel that coordinated the entire swarm. If he could hit it, if he could take it out, they would be thrown into chaos. He went to the bridge and made his proposal. The captain listened, then nodded slowly. The crew of the Sentinel evacuated to escape pods and shuttles, all except Ben. He stayed at the helm, alone on a dying ship, and aimed it at the command vessel. They tried to stop him, but the Sentinel was already moving too fast. Ben watched the command ship grow larger in his viewport and thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was 7 years old. She liked to draw pictures of spaceships. He hoped she would understand. At the last moment, Ben ejected. The Sentinel slammed into the command ship, and both vessels disappeared in a blinding explosion. By the end of the first day, humanity had lost 2 ships, but 18,000 colonists had been saved, and the swarm was reeling. The battle continued. The battle lasted 3 days. 3 days of fire and death and desperate courage. 3 days of human ships throwing themselves at an enemy that outnumbered them 100 to 1. 3 days of pilots flying until their fuel ran out, of Marines fighting until their ammunition was gone, of engineers holding broken ships together with nothing but willpower and prayer. They did not understand what was happening. They had fought countless species across thousands of years. They knew how wars were won. You gathered superior numbers, you applied overwhelming force, and you crushed your enemy. It was simple. It was logical. It always worked. But the humans refused to follow the rules. Every time they pushed forward, the humans pushed back harder. Every time a human ship was destroyed, its crew fought to the last breath. Every time the swarm thought they had broken through, another human vessel appeared in their path, weapons blazing, refusing to give ground. The commanders sent wave after wave of ships at the human fleet. They expected the humans to retreat, to preserve their remaining forces, to accept the mathematical reality of their situation. Instead, the humans stood their ground. They died by the hundreds, but they did not run. On the 3rd day, something happened that had never happened before in the long and bloody history of the swarm. They hesitated. The swarm's commanders looked at the battle and tried to calculate their next move. They had lost their command ship. They had lost dozens of carriers and hundreds of fighters. The humans were still fighting, still defending the evacuation corridor, still protecting the colony ships that continued to escape to safety. The mathematics no longer made sense. They should have won this battle in hours. Instead, 3 days had passed, and the human fleet was still there, battered and broken but undefeated. For the first time in their existence, they felt something they had never felt before. They did not have a word for it in their language, but other species did. Fear. On the morning of the fourth day, the fleet turned and they moved away from Seven, away from the burning planet and the stubborn human ships, and disappeared into the depths of space. Lisa stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched them go. She did not believe it at first. She kept waiting for them to turn around, to come back, to finish what they had started. But they did not. The fleet grew smaller and smaller on her screen until it vanished entirely. The communication channels went silent. It was not the silence of defeat or of death. It was the silence of shock. Across the entire sector, across 100 worlds and 1,000 ships, beings of every species stared at their screens and tried to understand what they had just witnessed. They had retreated. The swarm, the unstoppable force that had consumed civilizations and erased entire species from existence, had turned and run from a battle. And they had run from humans. In the great hall of the Galactic Council, Ambassador stood alone, watching the holographic display that showed the aftermath of the battle. The human fleet was crippled. Only 4 of their 6 ships remained, and all of them were badly damaged. The USS Resolute was barely holding together, its hull scorched black smoke still rising from a dozen wounds. The other 3 ships were in similar condition, drifting through space like ghosts. 412 human soldiers had died. They had died defending a world that was not their own, protecting people they had never met, fighting an enemy they had no obligation to face. And they had won. Opened a communication channel to the Resolute. For a long moment, there was only static. Then Captain Cole's face appeared on the screen. He looked terrible. His uniform was torn and stained with blood. A bandage covered the left side of his head, and his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. But when he saw, he managed a small smile. "Ambassador," he said, his voice rough and tired, "what can I do for you?" Did not know what to say. He had prepared speeches in his mind, grand words about courage and sacrifice, and the meaning of heroism. But now, looking at this battered human commander, all those words seemed hollow and inadequate. "Why," he asked finally, his voice barely a whisper, "why did you do it? Your people gained nothing from this battle. You had no treaty with Seven, no obligation to defend them. You knew you could not win. Why did you come?" Cole looked at him for a long moment. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, despite everything he had been through. "Because someone asked for help," he said simply. Waited for more but said nothing else. That was the entire answer. Someone had asked for help, so the humans had come. It was that simple. It was that profound. The channel closed and stood alone in the silent hall. Around the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The story of Seven was told and retold on 1,000 worlds. Some did not believe it at first. The defeated by a handful of human ships. Impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The recordings of the battle, the testimony of the survivors, the empty space where the swarm had once been. On the planet below, the survivors of Seven emerged from their shelters and looked up at the sky. Their world was damaged, perhaps beyond repair. Fires still burned across the surface, and the scars of the attack would take generations to heal. But they were alive. 3 million souls who had sent a desperate message into the void had been heard and answered. A young child stood with her mother at the edge of their ruined home and watched the human ships limp away toward the nearest. She did not understand everything that had happened. She did not know about tactics or strategy or the long history of the swarm. But she understood one thing. Strangers had come to save them. Strangers who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Strangers who had died so that she could live. She raised her hand and waved at the distant ships, knowing they could not see her but wanting to do it anyway. "Thank you," she whispered. In the silence of space, the human fleet continued on its journey. They left behind them a changed galaxy, though they did not know it yet. They had done something that no one had ever done before. They had shown the universe that they could be beaten. And more than that, they had shown something about themselves. They had shown what humanity was willing to do for strangers. The stars watched in silence, and everything was different. 10 years had passed since the Battle of Seven. In that time, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Old alliances had crumbled and new ones had formed. Trade routes that had been closed for centuries were now open. Species that had once viewed each other with suspicion now worked side by side. And at the center of all these changes, like a stone dropped into a still pond, was humanity. The Galactic Council had offered humans a seat at the highest table within months of the battle. It was an honor that usually took species centuries to earn, but no one had objected. How could they? The humans had done what no one else would do. They had answered a call for help when answering meant death. Jack Harrison was an admiral now. His hair had turned gray, and the lines on his face had deepened, but his eyes were still sharp, and his voice still commanded respect. He had spent the years since Seven building bridges between humanity and the other species of the galaxy. He had negotiated treaties, resolved disputes, and worked tirelessly to prove that humans were worthy of the trust the galaxy had placed in them. Today, he was returning to the place where it had all begun. A memorial station had been built in orbit around Seven. It was a beautiful structure, all white curves and gleaming metal, designed by architects from a dozen different worlds. Inside its walls were the names of every human who had died in the battle, carved in stone that would last for thousands of years. There were also the names of the civilians who had perished before the human fleet arrived, a reminder of what had been lost alongside what had been saved. Representatives from every species in the Galactic Council had gathered for the 10th anniversary ceremony. They filled the station's central hall, a vast chamber with windows that looked out onto the stars. Stood beside, diplomats mingled with human officers, and dozens of other species crowded together in a display of unity that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Ambassador was there, older now but still recognizable. He had become one of humanity's strongest advocates on the council, spending years arguing for closer ties between his people and the species that had once been dismissed as primitive. He caught Jack's eye across the crowded room and nodded once, a small gesture of respect between two beings who had been changed forever by the same event. Jack made his way to the podium at the front of the hall. The crowd fell silent as he approached, every eye turning toward him. He looked out at the assembled faces, human and alien alike, and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had prepared a speech. It was a good speech, full of noble words about sacrifice and courage and the bonds that united all sentient beings. But as he stood there looking at the faces before him, the speech suddenly felt inadequate. Instead, he spoke from the heart. 10 years ago, he said, I stood before the Galactic Council and said that humanity would answer the call from Seven. I remember the looks on your faces. Some of you laughed. Some of you thought we were fools. And honestly, you were probably right. By any reasonable measure, what we did was foolish. We were outnumbered. We had no chance of winning. He paused and let his words sink in. But we came anyway. Not because we thought we could win. Not because we had something to gain. We came because someone needed help and we were close enough to do something about it. He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of beings from worlds he had never visited, species he had never heard of before Seven. I have been asked many times over the years why humanity is the way we are. Why do we run toward danger instead of away from it? Why do we risk our lives for strangers? Why do we refuse to give up even when all hope is lost? Jack smiled slightly. I do not have a good answer. I am not a philosopher or a scientist. I am just a soldier who was raised to believe that some things matter more than survival. My grandfather taught me that. He was a firefighter, and when I was young, I asked him why he ran into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. He told me that fear is natural, but courage is a choice. He told me that the measure of a person is not what they do when things are easy, but what they do when things are hard. He gestured toward the windows and the stars beyond. Out there in the darkness between worlds, there are billions of beings living their lives, raising their families, hopping for a better tomorrow. They send signals into the void, asking for help, wondering if anyone is listening. And I believe that the answer to that question defines who we are. Not as humans, not as or any other species, but as people. As conscious beings who have the power to choose kindness over indifference, courage over fear, hope over despair. He lowered his voice, speaking now as if to each person individually. The humans who died at 7 did not die for glory or conquest. They died because they believed that every life has value, that every cry for help deserves an answer, that the universe is a little less dark when we stand together instead of standing alone. That is their legacy. That is what we honor today. Jack stepped back from the podium, and for a moment there was silence. Then the applause began, building slowly at first and then rising to a roar that shook the walls of the station. Beings of every shape and size rose to their feet, clapping and cheering and crying, united in their recognition of something that transcended species and worlds. After the ceremony, Jack walked through the station's corridors, wanting a moment of peace before the diplomatic obligations began. He found a quiet observation deck and stood before the window, looking out at 7 below. The planet had recovered remarkably well. The fires were long gone, and new cities had risen from the ashes of the old ones. 3 million survivors had grown to 5 million as refugees returned, and new settlers arrived, drawn by the story of a world that had been saved against all odds. A small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me." Jack turned and saw a young girl standing behind him. She was barely tall enough to reach his waist, her antennae twitching nervously. "Are you Admiral Harrison?" she asked. "I am," Jack replied, kneeling down to meet her eyes. The girl studied him seriously. "I have a question." "Go ahead." She hesitated, then spoke. "Are humans really not afraid of anything?" Jack smiled gently. "No," he said. "We are afraid of everything. We are afraid of death and pain and failure. We are afraid of losing the people we love. We are afraid of the darkness between the stars." The girl looked confused. "Then why do you always fight? Why do you always come when someone asks for help?" Jack placed his hand on her shoulder. "Because fear is not the opposite of courage. Fear is what makes courage possible. When someone needs help, we feel afraid just like anyone else. But then we go anyway. That is what makes us human." The girl nodded slowly, as if she had just learned the most important lesson of her life. Jack stood up and looked out the window one last time. The stars shone quietly, no longer cold and indifferent but watchful, waiting. Because now the galaxy knew the truth. When an SOS was sent, humanity answered. And when humanity arrived, even the stars fell silent.